Your vision will only become clear when you dare to look into your own heart. Those who look outside dream. Those who look inside awaken. Carl Jung wrote these words not from comfort, but from the trembling edge of madness itself. He was a man who stepped, deliberately, into the labyrinth of his own mind. A celebrated Swiss psychiatrist, admired across Europe's highest circles, who chose to risk everything, his reputation, his sanity, his name, to follow the voices that no one else could hear. For nearly 4 years, Jung spoke with invisible beings. He called them his guides, archetypes rising from the deep ocean of the unconscious. By candlelight he listened, and he wrote down every word they said. His colleagues whispered that he'd gone insane, but Jung did not turn back. He kept walking deeper, through dreams, through visions, through the darkness, until he returned with something extraordinary. A map. A way through the underworld of the human soul. And tonight, as the night air softens and the world grows still, we follow him there, into the quiet beneath thought, into the corridors where the mind speaks in symbols and shadows. Before we begin, if these stories bring you closer to calm, to sleep, or to something deeper, let this channel stay by your side too. Because every story we tell isn't just about history, it's about the unseen landscapes within us all. This is the Bedtime Biography of Carl Jung. Chapter 1. The Dreamer of Vienna, 1856 to 1881. The story begins far from Vienna, in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, part of the Austrian Empire, on May 6, 1856. A newborn named Sigismund Shlomo Freud came into a modest Jewish family. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and damp soil, and somewhere beyond the hills, Europe itself was shifting, old empires trembling at the dawn of science and reason. Freud's father, Jacob Freud, was a wool merchant, calm, stern, and practical. His mother, Amalia, was 20 years younger, spirited and protective, her affection shaping the boy's early world like sunlight across glass. From the start, Freud was different. He learned languages before he learned play: Latin, Greek, German, French. While other children chased laughter, he chased meaning. In 1860, the family moved to Vienna, then a beating heart of the empire, where the clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoed through cobblestone streets, and cafe windows glowed with ideas. This was the Vienna of Brahms, of Klimt, of art and intellect colliding in golden light. For young Freud, it was an awakening. At the University of Vienna, he studied medicine not for the body, but for the mystery behind it, the unseen clockwork of thought. By 1873, he was dissecting nerves under the pale light of oil lamps, tracing the threads that connect sensation to soul. The more he learned, the deeper his curiosity grew. What if the mind itself could be dissected? His professors spoke of anatomy and reflexes, but Freud's eyes wandered beyond. He saw dreams, slips of the tongue, fears and desires, all as clues to a secret realm within us. And though the world did not yet have a name for it, Freud would soon call it the unconscious. One evening, standing by the window of his small apartment, Freud watched the city sink into dusk, carriages fading into the fog, lamps flickering like thoughts in the night. He whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "There is more to a man than his waking mind." And that whisper became the seed of a revolution. Chapter 2. The Birth of Psychoanalysis, 1881 to 1899. By the year 1881, Sigmund Freud had completed his medical degree at the University of Vienna. He was 25, sharp-minded, impatient, and poor. The corridors of the university still echoed with the sound of his footsteps long after his graduation, as though Vienna itself knew he was not finished yet. At that time, medicine was a world of scalpels and microscopes. No one thought the invisible workings of the mind could be studied like the body. But Freud, he disagreed. He believed the mind had an anatomy of its own, not made of flesh but of fears, dreams, and hidden wishes. In 1885, Freud earned a small grant to study in Paris, under the great neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Paris that winter shimmered under gray clouds and gaslight, a city alive with ideas and revolution. Charcot was experimenting with hypnosis to treat patients suffering from hysteria, a mysterious condition that left people paralyzed, voiceless, or trembling without any physical cause. Freud watched as Charcot placed his hand gently on a woman's shoulder, whispered words softly, and her body changed. A tremor ceased. A tear fell. Something invisible, powerful, and emotional had moved within her. Freud was transfixed. It was as if he'd seen the human mind open its gates for the first time. He filled notebooks with sketches and thoughts. What if symptoms are not physical, but the echoes of forgotten pain? Returning to Vienna in 1886, Freud began his own practice on Bergasse No. 19, a narrow street lined with quiet apartments and flickering lamps. He married Martha Bernays, a woman of warmth and discipline, whose letters to him glowed with affection. Their home smelled of books, ink, and tobacco, the fragrance of thought. In his clinic, Freud listened to his patients speak. Women who trembled without reason. Men who felt guilt they could not name. They told him stories, fragments of memories, half-truths between tears. And Freud did something revolutionary. He did not silence them. He listened. He began to see a pattern, that hidden emotions, especially from childhood, did not disappear. They simply hid, shaping the adult soul in secret. He called it repression. And so, psychoanalysis was born, not with machines or scalpels, but with silence, empathy, and listening. In 1895, Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer published Studies on Hysteria. It was their first attempt to map the invisible, to show that memories, desires, and pain could shape the body and behavior alike. In those pages, Freud wrote a sentence that would echo through time. The hysteric suffers mainly from reminiscences. It was a poetic truth, that the past never truly dies, it only dreams within us. But Vienna did not understand him. Doctors mocked him. Friends distanced themselves. He was called a mystic, a dreamer, even a madman. And yet, alone in his study, under the dim glow of his lamp, Freud continued to write. He felt something immense approaching, a new language for the soul itself. Outside, the city turned to sleep. Inside, his pen moved like the hand of fate. And so, as another winter settled over Vienna, the young doctor looked into the firelight and whispered again to himself. If the body can speak in dreams, then the dream must be telling the truth. The next morning he would begin a work that would change history forever. The Interpretation of Dreams. Chapter 3. The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899 to 1905. Vienna, autumn of 1899. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and chimney smoke. Inside his study at Berggasse 19, Sigmund Freud sat beneath the soft flicker of lamplight, his papers spread across the desk like a storm waiting to be calmed. For nearly 10 years he had listened to the minds of others. Now he was ready to listen to his own. He began to record his dreams, strange fragments of memory and desire. He wrote of a patient, of a journey, of his own father's death. Every image, every symbol, seemed to whisper from the hidden corridors of his mind. And out of that whisper came the seed of an idea. That dreams are not chaos, they are messages from the soul. Freud worked through the night, often until dawn brushed the city's rooftops in gray. He smoked endlessly, pacing between sentences, his thoughts circling the same question. What is the purpose of a dream? He began to see patterns. That dreams disguise what the conscious mind cannot face. That each dream hides a wish, wrapped in symbols and riddles. And so, in that cold room, Freud discovered what he would later call the royal road to the unconscious. When The Interpretation of Dreams was published in November 1899, though dated 1900 to greet the new century, the world paid little attention. The book was long, dense, and strange. Few copies sold. But within its pages lay the foundation of a revolution. Freud wrote with quiet defiance. The dream is the disguised fulfillment of a suppressed wish. It was more than a theory, it was a key turning softly in the lock of the human heart. Each night Freud dreamed. He saw corridors, locked doors, staircases leading down into shadow. He began to understand that the mind itself was like a house. Bright rooms above and deep cellars below. In those depths lived what he called the unconscious, the true stage upon which life's dramas played. And with this insight, Freud became a cartographer of the invisible. He mapped guilt, love, repression, fear, tracing their paths like rivers beneath the soil of consciousness. He saw how a single childhood moment could echo through a lifetime, shaping the adult self in silence. But the cost was heavy. As Freud uncovered the layers of the mind, he found his own fears staring back at him. He wrote in a letter, "No one who awakens the unconscious escapes its power." His dreams grew darker. He saw his father's stern face, his children's future, his own mortality. He confessed to his friend Wilhelm Fliess that knowledge itself felt like a burden, a light too bright for the human eye. Yet still he pressed on. He believed that through understanding, suffering could be eased. That by bringing the hidden into the light, the human soul could breathe again. By 1905, Freud's theories had begun to spread quietly across Europe. In smoky Viennese cafes, young doctors and poets debated his ideas. Some mocked, others marveled. But even those who doubted him could not ignore the strange power of his words. He had given language to what had long been unspeakable. And one night, as he closed his manuscript and watched the candle burn low, Freud whispered, "Perhaps dreams are the guardians of sleep, not its enemies." Outside, the streets were silent. The city slept, unaware that its dreaming would never be the same again. ChatGPT said, Chapter 4, The Storm of Controversy, 1905 to 1919. The new century dawned upon Vienna in golden smoke and restless minds. The empire glittered, but its heart was beginning to tremble. Beneath the waltzes and marble, change was stirring. And at Bergasse 19, Sigmund Freud's quiet revolution was about to meet the noise of the world. By 1905, his ideas had begun to spread, through journals, lectures, whispers, and cafes. He had published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and within its pages lay words that would shock a civilization still wrapped in Victorian silence. Freud spoke of desire not as sin, but as a force, the hidden engine of the human psyche. He wrote that even childhood was not untouched by longing, that innocence and instinct were forever intertwined. For this he was condemned. Doctors called him immoral. Church leaders branded him a corrupter of youth. Even friends turned away, uneasy with the mirror he held up to humanity. But Freud did not flinch. He believed that truth, even when uncomfortable, could free the soul. He wrote to a colleague, "Where they burn my words, they burn the truth of themselves." In 1908, Freud gathered his few supporters, among them Carl Gustav Jung, a brilliant young psychiatrist from Switzerland, and Alfred Adler, another restless thinker from Vienna. They formed a small circle called the Wednesday Psychological Society, meeting in Freud's living room each week. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and argument. On the table lay coffee cups, papers, and the faint tension of discovery. They debated the human mind as though it were a new continent. Dreams, repression, childhood, love, death. Freud listened quietly, pipe in hand, his eyes half in shadow. He believed he had found not followers but heirs to the future of psychology. For a time he was almost happy. But every movement born of the mind eventually meets its own division. By 1912, disagreements deepened. Adler left, believing Freud overemphasized sexuality. Soon after, Jung too began to drift away, his thoughts turning mystical, spiritual, far from Freud's rooted realism. The break between Freud and Jung in 1913 was like the quiet shattering of glass. Freud had seen in Jung a son of the mind, a continuation of his dream. Their letters, once full of affection and curiosity, grew cold and cautious. Freud wrote bitterly, "The loss of a friend is the price we pay for the independence of thought." He carried that wound in silence. Then came 1914. The sound of guns thundered through Europe as the First World War erupted. Vienna, once the city of dreams, filled with soldiers, hunger, and fear. Freud's 3 sons were drafted. His patience vanished into the chaos of the front. The empire that had shaped his world began to crumble. In those dark years, Freud continued to work. He studied anxiety, war neurosis, and the fragile machinery of civilization itself. He saw that beneath every uniform and nation, the same unconscious instincts drove humanity: love and destruction, hope and fear. He called them Eros and Thanatos, the forces of life and death. By 1919, when the war finally ended, the old Europe was gone. Freud was 63, weary and ill, but his ideas had survived the battlefield. Psychoanalysis was no longer a whisper. It had become a language spoken in universities, hospitals, and homes. One evening, as he sat before the fire, Freud reflected quietly. The greatest war is not fought between nations, but within the soul of man. Outside, snow fell softly over Vienna. The empire was gone, but his vision endured. that to understand ourselves was the first step toward peace. Chapter 5, Exile and Legacy, 1920 to 1939. The year was 1920, and Vienna no longer glowed as it once had. The empire that raised Sigmund Freud had vanished, leaving behind hunger, inflation, and quiet disillusionment. The city's grand cafes, once alive with poets and thinkers, now echoed with the sound of emptiness. And yet, inside his dim apartment at Bergasse 19, Freud continued his lifelong dialogue with the human soul. That year he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It was not a young man's book. It was the work of someone who had seen war, loss, and mortality up close. In its pages, Freud dared to suggest something darker. That within every human being, alongside the instinct for life, there lives a shadow, the death drive, the quiet urge toward destruction and silence. He called it Thanatos. And beside it, he placed Eros, the force of love, creation, and survival. Between these two, he said, humanity is forever torn. Freud's own life by then was touched by pain. In 1923, doctors diagnosed him with cancer of the jaw, the result of decades of smoking cigars. The treatments were brutal. He endured more than 30 operations, each one leaving him weaker, yet his will unbroken. He wrote through the pain, speaking softly through a prosthetic palate, his words still sharp as glass. When visitors came, he greeted them with a faint smile and his ever-present cigar, an emblem of defiance. Despite illness, his mind burned with clarity. In 1930, he received the Goethe Prize, one of Germany's highest honors for intellectual achievement. He was an old man now, but still the quiet rebel who had taught humanity to listen inward. But Europe once again was darkening. By 1933, the Nazi Party had risen in Germany. Freud's books, his life's work, were thrown into flames by Hitler's supporters. In Berlin, students gathered in the square, shouting as the smoke rose. Someone read aloud the titles being destroyed. Among them, The Interpretation of Dreams. When Freud heard the news, he smiled bitterly and said, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages they would have burned me, now they are content with burning my books." It was the kind of humor only history's survivors possess. By 1938, the darkness reached Vienna itself. Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and Freud's home was raided. His daughter Anna Freud, herself a rising psychoanalyst, was briefly detained by the Gestapo. Friends pleaded with him to leave. But Freud hesitated, not from pride but from love for his city, the place where every dream and discovery had begun. Finally, with help from Princess Marie Bonaparte and the British Psychoanalytic Society, Freud and his family fled to London in June 1938. He was 82 years old. As the train carried him away from Vienna, he sat silently by the window. The city of his youth vanished behind him, its rooftops sinking into the haze like a dream fading before dawn. In London, Freud lived quietly at 20 Maresfield Gardens, surrounded by his books, artifacts, and memories. He continued to write. His final work, Moses and Monotheism, published in 1939, explored faith, identity, and the eternal human struggle to understand its origins. But his strength was fading. The pain from his illness grew unbearable, and by September of that year, he knew his time had come. On September 23, 1939, as Europe plunged into the Second World War, Sigmund Freud closed his eyes for the last time. The air outside was cold, filled with the first news of bombings. Inside, his daughter Anna sat beside him, holding his hand. The father of psychoanalysis drifted quietly into sleep, the dreamer returning to the silence from which all dreams begin. Yet his ideas did not die. They traveled farther than he ever could, through languages, schools, and generations. They reshaped art, literature, philosophy, and therapy itself. They taught us that within every person lives a story, unseen, unspoken, waiting to be understood. Even now, more than a century later, his voice seems to whisper through time. Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. And so, as the candle burns low and the world turns softly into night, we remember the man who taught humanity to look inward, to listen to its dreams, to face its shadows, and to find, even in silence, the truth of the soul. If these words have carried you gently toward rest, if the story of time and thought has become your lullaby tonight, then let this channel stay by your side. A quiet voice through the long corridors of history and sleep. If this story stirred something within you, take a quiet breath and let that feeling linger for a moment. Ask yourself, if you had lived in his time, in that same dim light of uncertainty and discovery, what would you have done? Would you chase the truth knowing it could isolate you, break you, even consume you whole? Would you defy the world's comfort to speak what others feared to hear? Or would you stay silent, watching the world drift further into its own illusions, its own unspoken shadows? These are not just his questions. They are ours too. Because the stories of visionaries, of dreamers and doubters, are never really about the past. They are mirrors held quietly before us. Tell us what you believe. What would you have chosen, comfort or courage, safety or truth? Your thoughts, your reflections. They are part of the same vast human puzzle that binds us all. And if your heart is drawn to wander further, to meet the dreamers, rebels, and forgotten souls who change the shape of the world, then stay close to global mysteries. For each night we look back into history, we are not only discovering their truth, we are uncovering our own. Candle, the world hides many truths until we dare to listen.